Tonight you will live another life. You will inhabit a body that is not yours, in a place that does not exist, having conversations with people who have never lived. You will experience this life with a vividness and emotional intensity that exceeds much of your ordinary waking experience. The fear you feel will be real fear. The love you feel will produce the same physiological signatures as love you feel for actual persons in your actual life. The locations you visit will have specific architectural details, particular qualities of light, distinctive smells and textures that you have never encountered in your embodied existence, and that you will not be able to identify as the products of your own creative imagination when you try to trace their sources upon waking. And then, in the morning, this entire life will be dismissed as having been merely a dream, with the dismissal being so automatic that you will rarely pause to consider what actually just happened to you during the hours of sleep that produced the experience. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is what these experiences actually are, what they tell us about the nature of consciousness and reality, and why the contemporary research and the contemplative traditions have both arrived at recognitions about dreams that exceed what the standard cultural framework allows. The starting point for any serious inquiry into this question is what current neuroscience has been able to document about the actual biology of dreaming. The field has been substantially transformed across the past several decades, with the older models of dreams as merely random neural noise, giving way to more sophisticated accounts that recognize dreams as genuinely meaningful neural processes with specific functions and specific structural features. The transformation began with the work of Alan Hobson and Robert McCarley at Harvard Medical School, who in 1977 published their activation synthesis hypothesis in the American Journal of Psychiatry. The hypothesis proposed that dreams arise when the cortex attempts to make sense of essentially random neural activity that originates in the brainstem during REM sleep. The proposal was influential for decades and shaped the standard scientific account of dreaming through much of the 20th century. But the hypothesis has been substantially revised in subsequent research, with the simple version of activation synthesis no longer considered adequate to account for what dreams actually involve. The most significant development in the field has been the work of Mark Solms, the South African neuropsychologist whose research has established that dreaming involves brain regions and processes that the original activation synthesis model did not adequately characterize. Solms's research, conducted across decades and summarized in his book The Hidden Spring, published in 2021, has documented that dreams arise from forebrain mechanisms involving the dopaminergic reward system, rather than from the brainstem mechanisms that the original Hobson-McCarley model emphasized. The dopaminergic basis of dreams establishes them as motivationally meaningful processes rather than as the random activity that the older model proposed. Patients with damage to specific forebrain regions involved in motivation and emotional processing lose the capacity to dream while retaining the capacity for REM sleep, with the dissociation establishing that dreams and REM sleep are distinguishable phenomena. The findings have substantially revised the standard account of dreaming, and the implications for what dreams actually are have been worked out in considerable detail across the subsequent research. The specific neuroanatomical basis that Solms's research has identified involves the ventromesial frontal regions and the connections between these regions and the limbic system. Damage to these regions produces the cessation of dreaming, even when REM sleep continues to occur on the standard physiological measures, with a dissociation establishing that the brainstem mechanisms that produce REM sleep are not sufficient for the production of the conscious experiences that constitute dreaming. The forebrain mechanisms that Solms's research has identified as the actual substrate of dreaming are the same mechanisms that mediate motivation and emotional engagement in waking life, with the implication that dreams are intrinsically meaningful rather than merely random in the way that the older models had assumed. The integration of these findings into the broader research on dreaming has produced a substantially more sophisticated account of what dreams are, with the implications for understanding consciousness during sleep being substantial. Solms has also articulated, in his more recent work, a broader framework within which consciousness itself is understood as a fundamentally affective phenomenon, rather than as a primarily cognitive one. The framework, developed across his collaborations with neuroscientist Jacques Panksepp and articulated most fully in The Hidden Spring, holds that the basic substrate of consciousness is the affective experience that the brainstem produces, with the cortical processes that contribute to higher-level conscious experience being elaborations on this affective foundation rather than the source of consciousness itself. The framework has implications for how the consciousness during dreaming should be understood, with the dreaming consciousness being a particular configuration of the affective consciousness that is the deeper substrate, rather than a deficient version of waking cognition. The framework provides a foundation for understanding why dreams have the specific phenomenological features that they have, with the affective intensity and the embodied immediacy of dream experience being natural consequences of the affective basis of consciousness that the framework articulates. A complementary line of research has been pursued by Antti Revonsuo, the Finnish cognitive neuroscientist, whose threat simulation theory has provided one of the most influential evolutionary accounts of why dreams exist. Revonsuo's argument, articulated across a series of papers and his 2010 book Consciousness, is that dreams have an adaptive function in simulating threatening events that the dreamer might encounter in waking life. The simulation allows the dreamer to rehearse responses to dangerous situations without the actual physical risks that the situations would involve, with the rehearsal having documented effects on subsequent performance in similar waking situations. The theory has been supported by the consistent finding that dreams disproportionately involve threatening content, with the proportion of threat-related dreams substantially exceeding what would be expected if dream content were merely random. The theory has also been extended to account for other functions of dreaming, including social simulation, with dreams providing a venue for rehearsing complex social interactions that the dreamer encounters in waking life. The cross-cultural evidence supporting the threat simulation framework has been particularly significant. Studies of dream content across widely different cultures, including hunter-gatherer societies, whose threat environments differ substantially from those of industrial societies, have documented consistent patterns of threat-related content that match the kinds of dangers actually present in each environment. The dreams of contemporary urban residents involve different specific threats than the dreams of hunter-gatherer cultures, but the proportional emphasis on threatening content remains consistent across the different cultural contexts. The finding establishes that the threat simulation function operates at a level that adapts to specific environmental conditions, rather than reflecting merely culture-specific anxieties, with the adaptation being one of the features that the evolutionary framework predicts. The work of Erin Wamsley at Furman University has provided some of the most precise empirical findings on the relationship between dreaming and memory consolidation. Wamsley's research, conducted across multiple studies including her influential papers on the cognitive neuroscience of dream content, has documented that dreams play a specific role in the consolidation of memories acquired during the preceding waking period. Subjects who dream about a task they have learned during the day show better performance on the task the following day than subjects who do not dream about it, with the relationship between dream content and subsequent performance being specific enough to suggest a direct causal role for dreaming in the consolidation process. The mechanisms by which dreaming contributes to memory consolidation have been worked out across the broader research program, with the integration of new memories into existing networks of knowledge being one of the documented functions that dreams accomplish. Robert Stickgold and Matthew Walker, who have led the modern research program on sleep and memory at Harvard Medical School and the University of California, Berkeley, respectively, have established that the relationship between dreaming and memory is not the simple replay that earlier models had assumed. The dreaming brain does not merely rehearse the events of the preceding day in their original form. The dreaming brain integrates new memories into existing networks of knowledge, with the integration involving creative recombination of elements that have been encountered separately in waking experience. Walker's book, Why We Sleep, published in 2017, summarized much of this research for general readers and articulated the broader framework within which dreaming is now understood as a creative cognitive process, rather than as the merely passive consolidation that earlier models had proposed. Walker's research has also documented the specific role that REM sleep dreaming plays in emotional regulation and the processing of difficult experiences. The neurochemical environment of REM sleep involves the substantial reduction of noradrenaline, the stress-related neurotransmitter that ordinarily accompanies the recall of emotionally charged memories. The reduced noradrenaline allows the brain to process emotionally charged experiences without the stress response that ordinarily accompanies them in waking life, with the processing being one of the documented functions that REM sleep accomplishes. The implications for understanding the role of dreams in mental health have been substantial, with disrupted REM sleep being implicated in various conditions including post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression. The dreams that occur during REM sleep are, on this framework, not merely passive byproducts of the neurochemical environment, but active processes through which difficult emotional content is integrated and resolved. The work of Sarah Mednick at the University of California, Irvine has extended these findings to document the specific role that dreaming plays in creative problem-solving. Mednick's research, conducted across multiple studies including her influential papers on creative incubation, has established that subjects who dream during a sleep period after working on a creative problem show better performance on the problem upon waking than subjects who do not dream about it or who do not sleep at all. The integration of seemingly unrelated elements that creative problem-solving requires appears to occur preferentially during the dreaming state, with the specific cognitive features of the dreaming brain being particularly suited to this kind of integration. The findings establish dreaming as a cognitive process that contributes substantively to creative achievement rather than as a merely passive byproduct of sleep. The phenomenon of lucid dreaming, in which the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming while the dream continues, has been the subject of particular research attention since the pioneering work of Stephen LaBerge at Stanford University in the 1970s and 1980s. LaBerge's research established that lucid dreaming is a real phenomenon with measurable neurological signatures, with lucid dreamers able to perform predetermined eye movements during their dreams that can be detected through electroculographic recording. The findings transformed lucid dreaming from a phenomenon that mainstream science had often dismissed as merely subjective into a documented capacity that can be cultivated through specific practices and that has features that distinguish it from ordinary dreaming. The work of Ursula Voss at the University of Bonn has extended these findings, with her research documenting that lucid dreaming involves specific brain activity patterns, including increased activation of frontal regions that are normally less active during ordinary dreaming. The activation pattern allows the lucid dreamer to retain metacognitive awareness within the dream, with the awareness being the feature that distinguishes lucid from ordinary dreaming experience. Voss and her collaborators extended these findings substantially in a 2014 study published in Nature Neuroscience, in which they used transcranial alternating current stimulation to induce lucid dreaming in subjects who had not previously experienced it. The stimulation, applied at specific gamma frequencies to the frontal regions during REM sleep, produced reports of lucid dreaming in approximately 70% of subjects, compared to almost no reports in the control conditions. The finding established that lucid dreaming has a specific neurological substrate that can be deliberately activated, with the substrate involving the gamma frequency activity in frontal regions that the broader research has identified as the signature of metacognitive awareness. The implications for understanding what consciousness involves during dreaming have been substantial, with the recognition that the brain has the capacity to support different qualities of conscious experience during sleep, depending on which neural systems are active. The contemporary research on lucid dreaming has documented that the practice can be cultivated through specific techniques developed across the various traditions and refined by modern researchers. The reality testing techniques that involve regular checks during waking life of whether one is dreaming, the wake back to bed techniques that involve waking briefly during the night before returning to sleep, the mnemonic induction techniques that involve specific intentions formed before sleep, all have documented effects on the frequency and stability of lucid dreams. The techniques have been integrated into a coherent practice that has been taught and practiced across various contexts, with the practice itself being one of the documented capacities that the contemporary research has confirmed. The contemporary research has also documented specific phenomena that resist standard explanations and that point toward the deeper questions that this inquiry will eventually address. The phenomenon of dream content that appears to involve information the dreamer does not consciously possess, the phenomenon of dreams that appear to anticipate events that the dreamer will subsequently encounter, the phenomenon of dreams that appear to involve communication between persons who are sleeping in different locations, have all been documented in various research programs and have all resisted easy reduction to standard cognitive mechanisms. The work of Stanley Krippner at Saybrook University, conducted across decades and summarized in his various books and papers, has documented apparent telepathic communication during dreaming under controlled experimental conditions. The findings have been controversial, and the methodological challenges of conducting such research are substantial, but the documented phenomena have not been definitively explained by standard cognitive accounts, and they remain part of the broader picture that the inquiry into dreams has to engage. The Maimonides Medical Center Dream Telepathy Studies, conducted by Krippner together with Montague Ullman and Charles Honiton in the 1960s and 1970s, established the methodological foundations for subsequent research on these phenomena. The studies involved sleeping subjects who were monitored for REM sleep, with a separate experimenter in another room concentrating on a randomly selected target image during the subject's REM periods. Upon waking, the subject reported their dreams, and independent judges later evaluated the correspondence between the dream content and the target image without knowing which target had been used. The studies documented statistically significant correspondences across multiple experimental sessions, with the effect sizes being modest but consistent enough to warrant continued investigation. The methodological rigor of the studies was substantial, and the results have not been definitively explained by ordinary cognitive mechanisms despite decades of subsequent analysis. The findings remain part of the broader research literature on the boundaries of consciousness during dreaming, with their interpretation continuing to be a matter of active scientific debate. The recent work of Rahul Jandial, the neurosurgeon at City of Hope, whose 2024 book, This Is Why You Dream, summarized the contemporary state of dream research for general readers, has integrated the various lines of investigation into a comprehensive framework. Jandial's framework recognizes the multiple functions that dreams accomplish, including memory consolidation, emotional regulation, creative problem solving, and the rehearsal of threatening and social situations. The framework also acknowledges the dimensions of dreaming that exceed what the standard cognitive functions can fully account for, with the recognition that dreams involve aspects of consciousness that the contemporary research has not yet fully characterized. Jandial's work represents the current synthesis in mainstream dream research, and the framework provides the foundation for the more specific findings that subsequent research will continue to develop. The work of Giulio Tononi, whose integrated information theory we considered in earlier inquiries, has been extended to provide an account of what consciousness actually involves during dreaming. Tononi's framework holds that consciousness corresponds to integrated information, with a specific quantitative measure of integration determining the specific phenomenal character of the consciousness. The framework predicts, on its application to dreaming, that the consciousness during dreaming should have specific features that distinguish it from waking consciousness, while preserving the integration that constitutes consciousness as such. The predictions have been tested against empirical findings on the neurological signatures of dreaming, with the framework receiving substantial support from the convergent evidence. The dreaming brain does sustain the integrated information that Tononi's framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness, with the specific integration being modified rather than eliminated during the various stages of sleep. The implications of Tononi's framework for understanding the difference between dreams that occur during REM sleep and the experiences that occur during the deeper stages of non-REM sleep have been particularly important. The framework predicts that consciousness should be most fully present during REM sleep when the integration of information is preserved, and should be substantially reduced during the deeper stages of non-REM sleep when integration is diminished. The predictions have been confirmed by the empirical findings on subjective reports of conscious experience during the various sleep stages. The dreams that subjects remember are predominantly REM sleep dreams, with the integrated information of REM sleep producing the conscious experiences that constitute dreaming as ordinarily understood. The non-REM sleep stages produce experiences with substantially reduced integration, and the experiences are correspondingly reduced in their phenomenological character even when some content is reported. The findings of Giulio Borjigin and her colleagues at the University of Michigan, whose work on consciousness in dying brains we considered in earlier inquiries, have particular relevance for understanding the relationship between dreaming and other altered states of consciousness. The gamma-wave surges that Borjigin's research has documented in the brains of dying patients have features that overlap with the gamma-wave patterns that have been documented during certain forms of dreaming, particularly during the most vivid and emotionally significant dreams. The overlap suggests that the brain mechanisms involved in dreaming and the brain mechanisms involved in the experiences during dying may share specific structural features, with the implications for what these mechanisms actually accomplish being part of what the inquiry into dreams has to address. The convergence between the phenomenology of vivid dreams and the phenomenology of near-death experiences has been noted by various researchers across the past several decades. Both phenomena involve heightened vividness, intense emotional engagement, the sense of encountering realities that exceed ordinary waking experience, and the integration of meaningful content that produces lasting effects on the experiencer. The convergence is not equivalence, with the specific contexts of dreams and near-death experiences being substantially different. But the structural parallels between the two phenomena suggest that they may involve common features of consciousness that the various altered states share, with the features being the focus of substantial current research. The work of Christopher Kerr at the Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo, whose research on end-of-life dreams has documented their consistent features and their meaningful effects on dying patients, has contributed important findings to this broader research program. Kerr's work, summarized in his 2020 book, Death is But a Dream, has established that the dreams of dying patients have specific features that distinguish them from ordinary dreams, with the features including frequent encounters with deceased loved ones and the sense of being prepared for what is coming. There is a particular feature of dreams that current research has not been able to fully explain and that points toward the deeper questions that the inquiry will eventually examine. The phenomenology of dreams includes specific features that distinguish them from any other form of subjective experience that humans report. The vividness of dreams often exceeds the vividness of waking experience, with dreamers reporting that they have seen, heard, smelled, and touched things in their dreams with a clarity and immediacy that ordinary waking perception rarely provides. The emotional intensity of dreams often exceeds the emotional intensity of waking life, with dreamers experiencing fear, joy, grief, and love at intensities that they may not encounter in their actual lives. The narrative coherence of dreams, while often peculiar in its logic, is typically sustained throughout extended episodes that have the quality of complete experiences rather than fragmentary impressions. And the sense of being present in the dream as an experiencing subject is, in most dreams, complete and unquestioned, with the dreamer not recognizing the constructed nature of the experience until the awakening that ends it. These features of dreams have led some researchers to propose that dreams provide a window into what consciousness actually is, when it is freed from some of the constraints that the embodied life imposes. The waking consciousness that ordinarily constitutes our experience is shaped by the requirements of survival in the physical environment, by the specific sensory inputs that the body receives, and by the cognitive demands of navigating the social and material world. The dreaming consciousness operates without these constraints, generating experience from internal sources without the immediate sensory input that ordinarily structures consciousness. The phenomenology of dreams may therefore reveal features of consciousness itself that the constraints of waking life ordinarily mask. The proposal has been articulated in various forms by serious researchers, and the proposal has implications for how the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate should be understood. The phenomenon of dreams that appear to involve places, persons, and situations that the dreamer has never encountered in waking life deserves specific attention. The standard cognitive account holds that dreams are constructed entirely from elements that the dreamer has encountered in waking experience, with the apparent novelty being the result of creative recombination of these elements. The account is correct for many dreams, but the account has difficulty with dreams in which the dreamer reports encountering specific places, persons, or situations that the dreamer can verify upon waking, that they have not encountered in waking experience, and that they could not have constructed from their existing knowledge. The phenomenon has been documented in various research programs, and the phenomenon has resisted easy reduction to the standard cognitive account. What dreams actually involve, when they involve elements that exceed what the dreamer's waking knowledge can account for, is one of the open questions that current research is working to address. The specific phenomenology of these dreams has features that distinguish them from ordinary creative recombination. The places that the dreamer encounters often have specific architectural details that the dreamer can describe with precision upon waking, with the details being internally consistent in ways that suggest the place actually exists rather than being constructed from fragments. The persons that the dreamer encounters often have specific personalities, mannerisms, and life situations that the dreamer can describe with similar precision, with the personalities being psychologically coherent in ways that pure construction would not easily produce. The situations that the dreamer encounters often involve information that the dreamer can verify upon waking they did not previously possess, with cases including dreams that have correctly anticipated specific events, dreams that have provided specific information about persons the dreamer subsequently encountered, and dreams that have included details about historical or geographical realities that the dreamer had no reason to know. The standard cognitive science response to these phenomena involves several auxiliary hypotheses. The dreamer may have encountered the relevant information without conscious awareness, with the dream then drawing on the unconsciously acquired information to produce the apparent novelty. The dreamer may be misremembering the dream upon waking, with the actual dream having been less specific than the post-waking recall reconstructs. The dreamer may be experiencing confirmation bias, noticing the dreams that happen to match subsequent reality while forgetting the much larger number of dreams that did not. These responses are not unreasonable, and they do account for many of the documented cases. But the responses do not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve, and the cases that resist these standard explanations have been documented carefully enough that they cannot be summarily dismissed. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed these questions with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has developed extensive accounts of the nature of dreams, with the practice of dream yoga providing detailed instructions for engaging with dreams as opportunities for spiritual development, rather than as merely automatic experiences that occur during sleep. The Islamic tradition has articulated the doctrine of ruya saliha, the truthful dream, with specific accounts of how genuine spiritual communication can occur during sleep, and with the recognition that some dreams provide access to information that exceeds what the dreamer's waking knowledge contains. The Christian tradition has developed accounts of dreams as one of the channels through which divine communication occurs, with the biblical narratives of dream-based revelation providing the foundation for substantial subsequent theological reflection. The Hindu tradition has articulated the doctrine of svapna, the dream state, as one of the four fundamental states of consciousness whose specific features the tradition has worked to characterize across thousands of years of philosophical reflection. And the work of Carl Jung in the 20th century has contributed a psychological framework within which dreams are understood as expressions of a collective unconscious that exceeds the individual psyche, with the framework having substantial parallels with the recognitions that the older contemplative traditions had articulated through their own different methods. What is striking about the convergence of these traditions is not merely that they all recognize dreams as significant phenomena. What is striking is the specific structural features that recur across the different accounts. The traditions consistently distinguish between ordinary dreams that arise from the dreamer's psychological contents and significant dreams that involve genuine encounters with realities exceeding the dreamer's waking. Knowledge. The traditions consistently develop practices for cultivating the capacity to remember, engage with, and learn from dreams. The traditions consistently warn against both the excessive dismissal of dreams as merely random and the excessive identification with dreams as if they were ordinary waking reality. The traditions consistently locate dreaming within a broader account of consciousness that includes other altered states, including deep sleep, contemplative absorption, and the experiences at the boundary of life and death. The convergence of these specific structural features across widely separated traditions, despite the different vocabularies and metaphysical frameworks within which the traditions operated, is one of the features that the inquiry will eventually examine in detail. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of what dreams actually involve may not be the merely psychological question that materialist frameworks have treated it as. The question may be a question about the nature of consciousness itself, with answers that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions are all in a position to engage from their own different angles. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own pre-scientific vocabularies recognitions about the structure of consciousness that contemporary research is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of dream experience that have a real basis in how consciousness is actually structured, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The relationship between current research and the contemplative traditions is, on this reading, one of mutual illumination rather than of competition. The body that reads these words will, tonight, undergo the cycle of sleep that produces the experiences that the inquiry has been examining. The brain will move through the various stages of non-REM and REM sleep that the contemporary research has documented in detail. The dreams that will occur during these stages will involve the integration of memories from the day, the consolidation of learned material, the emotional regulation of difficult experiences, the rehearsal of threatening and social situations, and possibly other functions that current research has not yet fully characterized. The experiences that you will have during these dreams will be subjectively vivid, emotionally intense, and structurally complex in ways that exceed what the merely random activity of earlier models could account for. The question is what these experiences actually are, what they tell us about the nature of the consciousness that generates them, and how the various frameworks that have been examining them can be brought into productive engagement with each other. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the deeper physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work on quantum approaches to consciousness and to the broader frameworks within which the experiences of dreaming can be understood as more than the merely cognitive processes that the standard framework has assumed. The answers that emerge will not be final answers. The questions are too deep for any current investigation to settle definitively, but the answers will be more substantive than the materialist dismissals that have dominated mainstream discussion of dreams. and they will be more rigorous than the speculative reassurances that popular literature on dreams has often offered. The inquiry deserves its proper seriousness, because the questions it addresses are questions about what you actually are as a conscious being and what you actually experience during the hours of your existence that your culture has trained you to dismiss as merely the products of sleep. There is something fundamentally wrong with the standard scientific account of dreams. The findings we have examined establish that dreams involve specific neurological mechanisms, that they accomplish identifiable cognitive functions, and that they have phenomenological features distinguishing them from other forms of subjective experience. But the standard account, in its mainstream form, treats these phenomena as the byproducts of brain activity that happen to produce subjective experience without raising deeper questions about what the experience actually is. The brain processes are real, the cognitive functions are documented, the phenomenology is consistent. But the question of what the dreaming consciousness actually is, what it tells us about the nature of consciousness as such, and how the experiences during sleep relate to the broader structure of reality, remains the question that the standard account does not adequately address. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether the standard account is actually correct, or whether the documented phenomena point toward features of consciousness that materialist frameworks have systematically overlooked. The question is not metaphysical speculation in the loose sense. The question is one that contemporary physics has been engaging directly through its investigations of quantum mechanics and its implications for the structure of consciousness. And what these investigations have begun to suggest, when they are taken together with the contemplative traditions that have addressed dreams across thousands of years, is something that no honest examination can leave unspoken. The starting point for this deeper inquiry is what quantum mechanics has established about the structure of physical reality and the implications of this structure for how we understand consciousness in general and dreaming in particular. The most influential interpretive framework that has developed within physics for thinking about these questions is the many worlds interpretation, articulated by Hugh Everett III in his 1957 doctoral dissertation at Princeton University. Everett's framework proposed that the apparent collapse of the quantum wave function during measurement, which the standard Copenhagen interpretation treats as a fundamental feature of physical reality, is actually an apparent phenomenon that arises from the entanglement between the observed system and the observing system. On Everett's analysis, the wave function does not actually collapse. The wave function continues to evolve according to the standard quantum mechanical equations, with each possible measurement outcome being realized in a different branch of the resulting wave function. The observer who measures the system becomes entangled with the system, with the resulting entangled wave function containing the observer in each of the different branches corresponding to each of the different measurement outcomes. The implications of Everett's framework have been the subject of extensive discussion across the past several decades. The framework has been developed by David Deutsch at Oxford, who has argued that the many worlds interpretation is the only interpretation of quantum mechanics that takes the equations seriously as a description of physical reality, rather than as a calculational device that requires additional assumptions about measurement. Deutsch's articulation of the framework, in his books The Fabric of Reality and The Beginning of Infinity, has presented many worlds as the implication of taking quantum mechanics literally, rather than as a speculative addition to the established physics. The framework has gained substantial support among working physicists, with surveys of the field documenting that many worlds is now considered a viable interpretation by a substantial portion of the physics community, even as it remains controversial overall. The technical articulation of the many worlds framework has been further developed by David Wallace at the University of Pittsburgh, whose 2012 book, The Emergent Multiverse, provides what is currently considered the most rigorous philosophical defense of the framework. Wallace's argument is that the branches of the wave function correspond to genuine physical realities rather than to mere calculational devices, with the multiplicity of branches being an irreducible feature of the universe described by quantum mechanics. The work of Lev Weidman at Tel Aviv University has provided complementary articulations with his contributions to the many worlds framework, including specific accounts of how the apparent randomness of quantum measurements can be reconciled with the deterministic evolution of the wave function. The convergence of these various technical developments has established the many worlds framework as a serious option within the foundations of quantum mechanics, even as the interpretive questions remain matters of active debate. The philosophical implications of the many worlds framework, when taken seriously, are substantial. If the wave function evolves deterministically and never collapses, then every quantum mechanical possibility that has any non-zero probability is realized in some branch of the resulting wave function. The branches proliferate continuously through the ordinary quantum events that are happening throughout the universe at every moment. The number of branches that have come into existence since the Big Bang is, on the framework, beyond what any standard mathematical notation can compactly represent. The conscious experience of any particular embodied being is therefore one specific thread through this enormously branching wave function, with the other threads being equally real but inaccessible from the perspective of any particular branch. The relevance of the many worlds framework for understanding dreams has been articulated by various researchers and thinkers across the past several decades. The basic intuition is that if the universe actually consists of multiple branches corresponding to different possible outcomes of quantum events, then the conscious experience that constitutes any particular embodied existence is itself one specific branch of the broader wave function. The other branches of the wave function are equally real on the many worlds framework, with the apparent uniqueness of the experienced branch being a feature of the embodied perspective rather than a feature of the underlying reality. The question that arises is whether dreams might involve some form of access to the broader wave function that ordinary waking consciousness does not provide, with the dream experiences being fragments of consciousness from the other branches that the dreaming brain somehow accesses. The proposal has substantial appeal in connection with the documented phenomena of dreams that involve novel content, anticipatory experiences, and the sense of inhabiting lives that exceed what the dreamer's waking experience can account for. But the proposal also has substantial difficulties that the inquiry has to acknowledge directly. The many worlds framework, in its standard physics formulation, does not include any mechanism by which conscious experience in one branch could access conscious experience in another branch. The branches are, on the standard framework, dynamically isolated from each other after the entanglement event that produces them. The proposal that dreams provide access to other branches therefore requires additional mechanisms that the standard framework does not provide, and the additional mechanisms have not been articulated in any rigorous form that the physics community has accepted. The careful position with respect to the many worlds framework and dreams is to acknowledge what the framework establishes and what it does not establish. The framework establishes that the universe may be substantially more structured than ordinary perception suggests, with multiple branches potentially existing alongside the one that any particular embodied consciousness experiences. The framework does not establish that dreams involve access to these other branches in any directly demonstrable way. The framework provides a context within which the question of dream content can be reformulated, with the recognition that the materialist framework is not the only available framework. But the framework does not by itself resolve the questions about what dream content actually involves, and the popular literature that has presented many worlds as if it directly explained the phenomenology of dreams has gone beyond what the actual physics establishes. A complementary framework that has been developed within the foundations of quantum mechanics is the implicate order articulated by David Bohm, whose work we considered in earlier inquiries. Bohm's framework proposes that the physical reality we ordinarily encounter is what he called the explicate order, the unfolded manifestation of a deeper underlying reality that he called the implicate order. The implicate order is the level at which what appears as separation in the explicate order is recognized as expressions of a deeper unity, with the apparent separations being features of how the implicate order unfolds into the explicate manifestation rather than features of the implicate order itself. The framework was developed by Bohm in conversation with the philosopher and contemplative teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti, and the framework has features that bear directly on the questions about dreams that the inquiry has been pursuing. The implication of Bohm's framework for understanding dreams is that the dreaming consciousness may have access to features of the implicate order that the waking consciousness does not ordinarily access. The waking consciousness operates predominantly at the level of the explicate order, with the constraints of embodied perception limiting access to the deeper structures from which the explicate manifestation derives. The dreaming consciousness, on Bohm's framework, may operate at a level that is closer to the implicate order, with the dream experiences being expressions of features of reality that the waking constraints normally filter out. The framework provides a context within which the documented phenomena of dreams that exceed waking knowledge can be understood, with the dreams accessing features of the implicate order rather than constructing experience entirely from materials acquired during waking life. The dialogues between Bohm and Krishnamurti, conducted across several decades and published in various volumes including The Ending of Time and the Future of Humanity, addressed the implications of the implicate order framework for questions about consciousness in considerable detail. The dialogues explored the recognition that ordinary thought patterns produce a fragmentation of consciousness that prevents access to the deeper reality, with various contemplative practices being identified as means by which this fragmentation can be suspended. The dreams that occur during sleep, on the framework that emerged from the dialogues, may represent a partial suspension of the fragmentation that ordinary waking thought maintains, with the resulting access to deeper structures being one of the features that gives dreams their characteristic phenomenology of vividness and meaningfulness that exceeds ordinary experience. The careful position with respect to Bohm's framework requires acknowledging the speculative status of its specific applications to dreams. Bohm himself did not develop the framework's implications for dreaming in detail, and the application has been worked out primarily by subsequent thinkers whose interpretations have varied substantially. The framework is grounded in serious physics, with Bohm's technical work in plasma physics and the foundations of quantum mechanics establishing his standing as a working physicist. But the application of the framework to specific questions about dreams involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established, and the inquiry has to mark these extensions as speculative even while engaging with them seriously. A related framework that has been articulated within the philosophy of mind is the filtering theory of consciousness, developed in various forms by William James, Henri Bergson, Aldous Huxley, and various subsequent thinkers. The framework proposes that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is rather filtered by it, with the brain functioning as a reducing valve that selects from a broader field of consciousness the specific contents that are relevant for survival and ordinary functioning. The framework provides resources for thinking about why dreams might have features that exceed what ordinary cognitive accounts can produce, with the reduced filtering during sleep allowing access to features of the broader field of consciousness that waking life filters out. The framework has been developed in various contemporary forms by researchers including Bernardo Kastrup, whose work on the philosophical implications of consciousness research has articulated a comprehensive framework within which the documented phenomena of altered states can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The careful position with respect to the filtering framework requires acknowledging substantial difficulties that the framework faces. The proposal that consciousness exists independently of the brain raises significant questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate that current research has not resolved. The proposal that dreams involve reduced filtering raises questions about why the filtering would be reduced, specifically during sleep, rather than during other states of altered consciousness. The proposal that the broader field of consciousness contains features that dreams access requires specifying what those features are and how the access actually works, with the specifics not being articulated in any rigorous form that the relevant research community has accepted. The framework provides resources for formulating questions about dreams that the merely materialist framework cannot formulate, but the formulation does not by itself constitute the answer, and the inquiry has to acknowledge this limitation while still engaging with what the framework offers. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests it has provides another framework within which the questions about dreams can be reformulated. The block universe interpretation of relativity, articulated most fully in the philosophical work of various physicists and philosophers, holds that the past, present, and future all exist with equal reality, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework derives from the implications of special relativity for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames, with different observers having different definitions of what counts as simultaneous, and the implications for any privilege present being substantial. The framework has been articulated by physicists including Hermann Minkowski in the early 20th century, and developed by subsequent thinkers including Hilary Putnam, Brian Greene, and various others working at the intersection of physics and philosophy. The relevance of the block universe framework for dreams has been articulated by various researchers across the past several decades. If the future exists with equal reality to the past, on the framework, then the question of how a dreamer might access information about the future that has not yet occurred in their experience timeline becomes a question about the mechanisms of access rather than about the metaphysical possibility. The future is, on the framework, already there. The question is whether the dreaming consciousness has access to information about the future that the waking consciousness does not have. The framework does not by itself establish that such access actually occurs, but the framework removes the metaphysical objection that the future does not exist and therefore cannot be accessed, with the question becoming an empirical question about what mechanisms might be involved. The careful position with respect to the block universe framework and dreams is to acknowledge what the framework establishes and to mark the speculative status of its specific applications. The framework is grounded in the established physics of relativity, with the implications for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames being a matter of mathematical demonstration rather than philosophical speculation. The application of the framework to questions about dream content involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established, with the specific mechanisms by which dreaming consciousness might access information about the future remaining unspecified in any rigorous form. The framework provides resources for thinking about these questions that exceed what the merely classical framework allows, but the resources are resources for formulation rather than for definitive answers. The work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff on the quantum substrate of consciousness, which we examined in earlier inquiries, has direct implications for how dreaming should be understood. The orchestrated objective reduction theory holds that consciousness is associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules within neurons, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states. The framework has implications for how the various states of consciousness should be understood, including the dreaming state. The dreaming brain, on the framework, sustains specific patterns of quantum coherence in its microtubules that produce the conscious experiences associated with dreams, with the patterns being different from the patterns that produce waking consciousness, but related to those patterns through the underlying quantum mechanical processes that the framework articulates. The specific predictions of the Penrose-Hameroff framework for dreaming have been articulated across various publications by Hameroff and his collaborators. The framework predicts that dreams should involve quantum coherent processing that operates with reduced constraints compared to waking consciousness, with the reduced constraints allowing for the kind of fluid recombination of content that dreams characteristically exhibit. The framework also predicts that the boundary between self and environment that ordinarily structures waking consciousness may be substantially reduced during dreaming, with the reduction being a feature of the modified quantum coherent processing that the dreaming brain sustains. The empirical tests of these predictions have been challenging given the technical difficulties of measuring quantum coherent processes in living neural tissue, but recent work by Jack Tuszynski at the University of Alberta and other researchers in the field has documented quantum coherent vibrations in microtubules under physiologically relevant conditions, with the findings being consistent with the framework's predictions even as the broader implications remain controversial. The 2024 work conducted by Mike Wiest and his collaborators at Wellesley College, examining the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness, has provided additional empirical support for the broader framework. The studies documented that anesthetics that bind to microtubules produce specific effects on consciousness that are consistent with the predictions of the orchestrated objective reduction theory, with the convergence between the predicted and observed effects being one of the more striking findings in this difficult research area. The implications for understanding consciousness during dreaming follow from the same theoretical foundation, with the dreaming consciousness being a particular configuration of the quantum coherent processing that the framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness in general. The implication of the Penrose-Hameroff framework for the question of whether dreams involve access to features of reality beyond what waking experience accesses is significant. If consciousness is a quantum mechanical phenomenon involving entangled coherent states, as the framework proposes, then the consciousness during dreaming may have access to features of the underlying quantum reality that the more constrained patterns of waking consciousness filter out. The proposal is speculative in its specific applications, and the inquiry has to mark the speculative status carefully. But the framework provides a specific physical mechanism within which the question of dream access to broader features of reality can be formulated, with the formulation being one that connects to the broader questions about consciousness that the larger investigation has been pursuing. A complementary framework developed within the foundations of consciousness research is the holographic principle and its implications for how information about reality is encoded. The holographic principle, developed in the context of black hole physics by Gerard Hooft and Leonard Susskind in the 1990s, holds that the information content of any volume of space can be represented on the two-dimensional boundary of that volume. The principle has been extended to broader contexts within theoretical physics, with implications for how the information that constitutes reality is fundamentally structured. The relevance of the holographic framework for dreams has been articulated by various researchers, including the work of Carl Pribram on the holographic brain hypothesis. Pribram's framework, developed across multiple decades and articulated in his books on the brain and consciousness, holds that the brain encodes information through holographic principles, with each part of the brain containing information about the whole. The framework provides resources for understanding how dreams might access information that the standard cognitive account would not allow, with the holographic encoding providing a mechanism for the integration of distributed information that dream content sometimes exhibits. There is a particular set of claims that has been made in popular literature on dreams that deserves explicit examination because it has been the source of substantial confusion. The claims involve the proposition that dreams provide direct access to parallel universes in the many worlds sense, with the dreamer literally experiencing the lives that they are living in alternate branches of the wave function. These claims have appeared in various books and articles that have presented themselves as bringing the insights of quantum mechanics to bear on questions about dreams. The claims have to be addressed directly because they distort what the actual physics establishes, and because they have shaped popular understanding of these topics in ways that exceed what the science supports. The claims are not correct as stated. There is no mechanism in the standard many worlds framework by which a consciousness in one branch could access the experiences of a consciousness in another branch, and the popular claims that present dreams as such access have not articulated any specific mechanism that the physics community would accept. The branches of the many worlds wave function are dynamically isolated from each other, with the entanglement that produces the branches preventing the information transfer that the popular claims would require. The dream experiences that involve elements exceeding waking knowledge can be accounted for through other mechanisms including unconscious memory, creative recombination, and the various features of the dreaming brain that current neuroscience has documented. The interpretation of these experiences as direct access to parallel branches goes beyond what the physics establishes and beyond what the careful application of the framework would warrant. The technical reasons for the limitation have been articulated by various physicists who have addressed these questions seriously. The dynamics of the wave function in the many worlds framework are unitary, meaning that the evolution preserves the structure of the wave function without permitting interactions between branches that have already separated through decoherence. The decoherence that occurs in any complex physical system, including a brain, occurs on extremely short timescales that prevent the kind of sustained coherent connections between branches that the popular claims would require. The work of Wojciech Zurek on decoherence theory, conducted across decades at Los Alamos National Laboratory, has established the rigorous mathematical foundations for understanding why the branches of the wave function become dynamically isolated from each other once decoherence has occurred. The implications for the popular claims about dream access to parallel branches are clear. The physics does not support the claims, and the claims should be recognized as speculative additions to the actual physics rather than as implications of the established science. The honest engagement with the question of what dreams actually involve requires distinguishing what the various physical frameworks establish from what they do not establish. The frameworks establish that the deepest physical structure of reality is more sophisticated than classical thinking allowed. The frameworks do not establish that this sophistication takes the specific form of dream access to parallel branches. The frameworks open possibilities that the standard materialist framework forecloses. But the possibilities are possibilities, not demonstrated realities, and the careful inquiry has to maintain this distinction throughout its engagement with these topics. The popular literature that has collapsed this distinction has done substantial damage to public understanding of both the physics and the phenomenology of dreams, and the inquiry has to resist the temptation to participate in the collapse, even while engaging seriously with the questions that the physics raises. What the various physical frameworks do provide, however, is a context within which the question of what dreams involve can be formulated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The frameworks do not establish that dreams provide access to other branches of the wave function, to features of the implicate order, to information about the future, or to any specific alternative to the standard cognitive account. The frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics rule out any deeper account of dreams, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest forms of the alternative accounts remain speculative, even as they are framed within the rigorous physics that has been established. The work on retrocausality and the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics by Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators provides additional resources that bear on the questions about dreams. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being shaped by both its past and its future. The implications of this framework for dreams are speculative in their specific applications, but the framework provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of how the present consciousness might be informed by the future can be formulated. If the present states of the brain are constrained by future as well as past boundary conditions on the framework, then the dreaming consciousness might be shaped by features of the future that the waking consciousness does not access. The framework is grounded in serious physics, but the application to dreams involves theoretical extensions that the physics community has not endorsed in any consensus form. The empirical work that has been conducted to test specific predictions of the retrocausality framework has produced findings that the inquiry should acknowledge. The work of Darrell Bem at Cornell University, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2011, documented apparent precognitive effects in laboratory experiments involving subjects responding to stimuli that had not yet been presented. The findings were highly controversial and have been the subject of substantial subsequent investigation, with the replication record being mixed. The careful position with respect to these findings is to recognize their controversial status while also recognizing that they have not been definitively refuted, with the questions they raise about the temporal structure of consciousness remaining part of the broader research literature, even as the specific findings remain contested. The convergence of these various frameworks on the recognition that the deepest physical structure of reality is more interconnected and more temporally extended than classical thinking allowed provides a context within which the documented phenomena of dreams can be understood without forcing them into the merely materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion. The frameworks do not establish any specific alternative to the materialist account as the correct account of dreaming. The frameworks establish that the materialist framework is not the only available framework, that serious physical and philosophical alternatives exist, and that these alternatives have features that bear directly on the questions about dreams that the inquiry has been pursuing. The careful application of these alternatives requires acknowledging their speculative status, but the speculative status does not exhaust their significance. The frameworks open possibilities that the standard materialist framework forecloses, and the possibilities deserve serious engagement rather than the dismissal that they have often received in mainstream scientific discussion. The position that has been articulated by David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and other contemporary philosophers concerning the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate provides a complementary framework for thinking about dreams. If consciousness is, as the various proto-panpsychist positions suggest, a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, then the consciousness during dreaming is not the deficient version of consciousness that the materialist framework treats it as. The consciousness during dreaming is a particular configuration of the fundamental consciousness that constitutes reality at the deepest level, with the specific features of this configuration being different from those of waking consciousness, but not deficient in any sense that would prevent the configuration from accessing features of reality that the waking configuration does not access. The framework provides resources for thinking about why dreams have the specific phenomenological features they have, with the affective intensity, the embodied immediacy, and the apparent access to information beyond ordinary waking knowledge, being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The careful position with respect to all of these frameworks is to recognize what they offer and what they do not offer for the inquiry into dreams. They offer alternatives to the materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion, with the alternatives being grounded in serious physics and philosophy. They do not offer definitive answers to the questions about what dreams actually involve, with the questions remaining open in ways that current research is working to address. They provide a context within which the contemplative traditions, which have addressed these questions across thousands of years, can be engaged seriously rather than dismissed as merely the products of pre-scientific thinking. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the structure of consciousness that the contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what dreams actually are and what they actually accomplish. The body that reads these words will, tonight, undergo the cycle of sleep that produces the experiences that the inquiry has been examining. The brain will move through the various stages of non-REM and REM sleep that contemporary research has documented in detail. The dreams that will occur during these stages will be, on the various frameworks that have been examined, expressions of consciousness, in particular configurations that may have access to features of reality that the waking consciousness does not access. The specific features of this access remain to be characterized, with the contemporary research continuing to investigate what the dreaming brain actually accomplishes. The frameworks that have been examined provide resources for formulating these questions more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The contemplative traditions provide additional resources from a different direction, and the convergence between these various sources of insight is what the next stage of the inquiry will examine, with the recognition that the question of what dreams actually involve is a question that has been engaged by some of the most sophisticated minds of multiple cultures across thousands of years, and that continues to be one of the most significant open questions in the contemporary investigation of consciousness. Long before any laboratory could measure REM sleep or any framework existed for thinking about quantum coherence in microtubules, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of what dreams actually are and what they actually accomplish. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to dreams themselves, the contemplative practices that engage dreams directly while still embodied, and the philosophical reflection on what dreams must be if they are the kind of thing that the traditions have observed them to be across thousands of years of careful examination. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that dreams are not merely automatic byproducts of sleep, but are significant phenomena that can provide access to dimensions of reality that ordinary waking consciousness does not access. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about the biology and physics of dreaming is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated about the nature of dreams. The most technically developed treatment of dreams within any contemplative tradition appears in Tibetan Buddhism, where the practice of dream yoga has been developed across more than 1,000 years of sustained refinement. The practice belongs to the broader tradition of the 6 yogas of Naropa, the 11th century Indian Buddhist master whose teachings shaped the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism and whose 6 yogas have been the foundation of subsequent Tibetan tantric practice. The 6 yogas include practices for working with the heat of the subtle body, for working with the illusory body, for working with the bardo states between death and rebirth, and for working with dreams. The dream yoga practice, called milam in Tibetan, has been developed in particular detail across the various Tibetan Buddhist lineages, with the practice receiving extensive treatment in the writings of Tibetan masters from Naropa's time through the present. The fundamental insight that Tibetan dream yoga articulates is that dreams provide an opportunity for the cultivation of awareness that the constraints of waking life do not equally provide. The waking consciousness operates within the constraints of physical embodiment, with the demands of survival in the material environment limiting the kinds of awareness that can be cultivated. The dreaming consciousness operates without these constraints, providing what the tradition calls a more flexible substrate for the cultivation of awareness. The practice of dream yoga involves the deliberate cultivation of the capacity to recognize that one is dreaming while the dream continues, with this recognition providing the foundation for further practices that the tradition has developed in considerable detail. The capacity to recognize the dream as a dream, what the tradition calls lucid dreaming, and what contemporary research has documented as a real phenomenon with measurable neurological signatures, is treated by the tradition as the entry point into a broader practice rather than as the goal of the practice itself. The instructions for cultivating dream yoga, articulated in detail in texts such as the 6 yogas of Naropa, attributed to Tilopa and his disciple Naropa, and in the more recent writings of teachers, including Tenzin, Wangyal Rinpoche, and Tarthang Tulku, involve specific techniques for preparing the consciousness for the dreaming state. The preparations include specific contemplations during the day that cultivate the recognition of the dreamlike quality of waking experience itself, with this recognition being identified as the foundation for the recognition of dreams as dreams. The preparations also include specific techniques during the period of falling asleep, with the practitioner maintaining specific points of attention as the consciousness transitions from waking to dreaming. And the preparations include specific practices upon waking that engage with the dreams that occurred during the night, with the engagement being one of the means by which the practice deepens over time. Once the lucid recognition of the dream has been established, the dream yoga tradition develops further practices that work with the resulting awareness. The practitioner is instructed to transform the dream content through specific intentions, with the transformations being practices that develop the recognition that all phenomena are insubstantial in the same way that dreams are insubstantial. The practitioner is instructed to multiply the dream content, generating multiple instances of dream objects to develop the recognition that quantity itself is malleable in the dream state. The practitioner is instructed to traverse the dream content, moving freely through dream environments to develop the recognition that spatial limitations are not what they appear to be. And the practitioner is instructed to dissolve into the dream content, allowing the apparent boundary between the dreaming self and the dream environment to dissolve in ways that develop the recognition of the deeper unity that the apparent separation conceals. The practices are not merely psychological exercises. The practices are, on the tradition's own articulation, training in the recognition of the structure of consciousness itself, with the training extending beyond the dream state into the broader life of the practitioner. The relationship between dream yoga and the broader Tibetan Buddhist treatment of consciousness across the various states has been articulated in considerable detail across the tradition's literature. The waking state, the dreaming state, the deep sleep state, and the various states that arise between death and rebirth that the tradition calls the bardos are all treated as different configurations of the same underlying consciousness. The practices that the tradition has developed for engaging with each of these states are connected through the underlying recognition that consciousness itself is not different in the different configurations, even as the specific phenomenology varies substantially. The practitioner who develops the capacity to engage consciously with the dreaming state is, on the tradition's articulation, simultaneously developing the capacity to engage consciously with the bardo states that arise between death and rebirth, with the parallel structure of the various states making the dream practice a preparation for the more challenging practices that the bardo states require. The Bon tradition, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Tibet that predates the introduction of Buddhism and that has continued to develop alongside the Buddhist tradition for more than 1,000 years, has its own sophisticated treatment of dream yoga that has been articulated in contemporary form by teachers including Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. His book, The Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, published in 1998, has provided one of the most accessible contemporary treatments of these practices for English language readers. The Bon framework distinguishes between samsaric dreams that arise from the karmic patterns of the dreamer and dreams of clarity that arise from deeper levels of consciousness, with the practice of dream yoga aiming to develop the capacity to recognize and work with both categories. The framework has substantial parallels with the Buddhist framework that has developed in dialogue with it across the centuries, with the two traditions enriching each other through their continued engagement. The Dzogchen tradition within Tibetan Buddhism, often considered the most developed framework for understanding consciousness within the broader tradition, has provided particularly sophisticated treatments of the relationship between dreaming and the recognition of the nature of mind. The Dzogchen framework holds that the recognition of the nature of mind, what the tradition calls Rigpa, is the fundamental orientation that the practice cultivates. With this recognition being available across all states of consciousness, including dreaming, the dream yoga practices that the Dzogchen tradition has developed are oriented toward the cultivation of Rigpa within the dream state, with the resulting practice being not merely the recognition of dreams as dreams, but the recognition of the nature of mind that is present throughout the various states. The framework has been articulated in detail across the writings of Dzogchen masters from Longchen Rabjam in the 14th century through contemporary teachers including Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, with a consistent recognition being that dream practice is one of the principal venues for the cultivation that the tradition aims to develop. The contemporary documentation of these practices through the engagement between Tibetan teachers and Western researchers has produced findings of substantial interest. The work of Stephen LaBerge, whose foundational research on lucid dreaming we considered earlier, has included engagement with Tibetan dream yoga practitioners and integration of insights from these practitioners into the broader research on lucid dreaming. The Mind and Life Institute, founded in 1987 to facilitate dialogue between Buddhist contemplatives and scientific researchers, has hosted multiple conferences specifically addressing the questions about dreaming that the various frameworks engage. The conferences have produced substantial documentation of the convergences between contemplative and scientific accounts of dreams, with the documentation continuing to inform research at the intersection of these fields. The Islamic tradition has developed its own sophisticated framework for thinking about dreams, with the framework being grounded in the foundational texts of the tradition and developed across more than 14 centuries of sustained reflection. The Quran itself contains numerous narratives of significant dreams, with the most extended treatment appearing in the 12th chapter, the chapter of Yusuf, which centers on the dreams that Yusuf experienced and interpreted across his life. The chapter opens with Yusuf reporting to his father a dream of 11 stars, the sun, and the moon prostrating to him, with the dream being interpreted across the subsequent narrative as a foreshadowing of his eventual rise to a position of authority in Egypt. The chapter continues with Yusuf interpreting the dreams of fellow prisoners during his captivity and eventually interpreting the dream of the Egyptian ruler that leads to his release and elevation. The narrative establishes the framework within which the Islamic tradition has subsequently understood dreams, with significant dreams being recognized as channels through which divine communication can occur, and with the interpretation of dreams being recognized as a discipline that requires both knowledge and spiritual maturity. The Hadith literature, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, contains extensive teachings about dreams that have shaped the subsequent Islamic understanding. The Prophet is reported to have said that the truthful dream, Ruya Saliha, is one part of 46 parts of prophecy, with the saying, establishing dreams as a continuing channel of authentic spiritual experience, even after the cessation of formal prophetic revelation. The Hadith literature distinguishes 3 categories of dreams, with the first being the truthful dream from God that carries genuine spiritual content, the second being the dream from the lower self that reflects the dreamer's psychological contents and desires, and the third being the dream from the Satan that involves disturbing or misleading content. The framework provides the foundation for the discernment practices that the tradition has subsequently developed, with the practitioner being trained to distinguish among the different categories and to engage appropriately with each. The classical Islamic literature on dream interpretation, articulated most fully in the works of Ibn Sirin in the 8th century, and developed by subsequent commentators, including Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi in the 17th century, has provided detailed frameworks for understanding what specific dream contents may indicate. The frameworks are not the merely arbitrary symbol systems that some superficial accounts have presented them as. The frameworks are grounded in specific principles articulated within the tradition, including the recognition that dream content draws on the dreamer's actual life situation, that dreams from God speak in symbolic language that reflects the dreamer's spiritual state, and that the proper interpretation of dreams requires both knowledge of the traditional frameworks and spiritual discernment that cannot be reduced to merely mechanical symbol decoding. The literature has been studied across the Islamic world for more than 1,000 years, with the practical interpretation of dreams remaining an active discipline within Islamic spiritual life into the present. The Sufi mystical tradition within Islam has developed the dream framework with particular sophistication. The Sufi recognition that the soul has dimensions that extend beyond what ordinary embodied experience accesses provides a framework within which the documented phenomena of dreams that exceed waking knowledge can be understood. The dreams of the soul, in Sufi articulation, may involve genuine encounters with realities that the embodied life does not access through other channels, with the encounters being structured by the spiritual development of the dreamer in ways that the tradition has worked to characterize across centuries of sustained reflection. The work of Ibn Arabi in the 13th century, particularly his treatment of dreams and visions in his vast Meccan Revelations and other works, has provided one of the most philosophically articulated treatments of these phenomena within any tradition. Ibn Arabi distinguished different levels of imaginal experience, with the higher levels involving genuine encounters with spiritual realities and the lower levels involving the merely psychological projections that the dreamer's own state produces. The concept of the imaginal realm, what Ibn Arabi called the Alam al-Mithal, has been one of the most significant contributions of the Sufi tradition to the broader understanding of dreams. The imaginal realm is, on Ibn Arabi's articulation, an intermediate level of reality between the physical world and the purely spiritual realm, with the realm having its own genuine ontological status rather than being merely the subjective contents of consciousness. Dreams and visions, on the framework, can involve encounters with realities that exist in the imaginal realm, with the encounters being neither merely subjective nor identical to encounters in the physical world. The framework has been developed by subsequent Sufi thinkers and was given particular attention by the 20th century French scholar Henry Corbin, whose extensive scholarship on Sufi spirituality articulated the framework for Western readers and connected it to broader questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. The Persian Sufi poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, who lived in the 13th century and whose Mesnavi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, addressed dreams across his vast corpus with characteristic depth. Rumi treats dreams as one of the principal venues through which the soul can access dimensions of reality that the constraints of waking life ordinarily conceal, with the engagement with dreams being part of the broader spiritual journey that his poetry articulates. His verses on dreams articulate the recognition that what the dreamer encounters in significant dreams may have an ontological status that exceeds what the merely subjective interpretation would allow, with the articulation being characteristic of the broader Sufi engagement with these questions. The integration of Rumi's poetic articulations with the more technical philosophical articulations of Ibn Arabi and other Sufi thinkers has produced one of the most sophisticated bodies of reflection on dreams within any tradition. The Anatolian Sufi tradition that emerged in the centuries following Rumi has continued the engagement with dreams as part of the broader spiritual life that the tradition has cultivated. The various Sufi orders that have developed across the Islamic world have all integrated the engagement with dreams into their broader spiritual practices, with the specific forms of engagement varying across the different orders, but with the underlying recognition being consistent. The dream that comes during a period of spiritual practice is, across the various orders, treated as significant content that deserves engagement rather than as the merely random byproduct that the materialist framework would treat it as. The engagement is structured by the broader frameworks that the orders have developed, with the discernment of genuine spiritual content from merely psychological content being one of the disciplines that the orders have cultivated across their long histories. The practice of istikhara, the prayer for divine guidance that is performed before making important decisions, has been integrated into the Islamic dream framework as one of the practical disciplines through which the dream channel of communication is engaged. The practice involves a specific prayer asking God for guidance regarding a particular decision, with the practitioner then attending to the dreams and inner intuitions that arise in the period following the prayer. The practice has been part of Islamic spiritual life for more than 1,000 years, with the framework providing a structured way of engaging with the recognition that genuine guidance can come through dreams without requiring any specific claim about the mechanism by which the guidance occurs. The practice continues to be widely employed across the Islamic world into the present, with its persistence being one of the indications of the continuing significance of dreams within Islamic spiritual life. the Christian tradition contains its own substantial treatment of dreams, with the tradition's foundational texts containing numerous accounts of significant dreams and with the subsequent theological reflection developing across 2,000 years of sustained engagement. The Hebrew scriptures that the Christian tradition received from Judaism contain extensive accounts of dreams, with the dreams of the patriarchs Joseph and Jacob, the dreams of Pharaoh that Joseph interpreted, the dreams of King Solomon at Gibeon, and the dreams of the prophet Daniel providing the foundational narratives for the subsequent tradition's understanding. The Christian scriptures continue this engagement with dreams, with the dreams of Joseph, the husband of Mary, providing crucial guidance during the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, the dreams of the Magi providing the warning that allowed them to avoid Herod, and the dream of Pilate's wife providing the testimony to the innocence of Jesus before his crucifixion. The narratives establish dreams as a recognized channel through which divine communication can occur within the Christian framework, with the framework being developed in the subsequent theological tradition. The early Christian theological tradition engaged dreams seriously across its first several centuries. Tertullian, the 2nd and 3rd century North African theologian, devoted substantial attention to dreams in his treatise on the soul, articulating a framework within which the various sources of dream content could be distinguished and the proper engagement with dreams could be guided. Augustine of Hippo addressed dreams across his various works, with the engagement reflecting both his philosophical interests in the nature of consciousness and his theological interests in the modes of divine communication. Synesius of Cyrene, the early 5th century bishop and philosopher, devoted an entire treatise to dreams, with his On Dreams articulating a sophisticated framework within which dreams were understood as one of the principal means by which the soul accesses dimensions of reality that exceed the constraints of embodied experience. The framework that Synesius articulated had substantial influence on the subsequent Christian tradition's engagement with dreams, even as the tradition developed in directions that occasionally moved away from his specific commitments. The medieval Christian tradition continued the engagement with dreams, with various theological works addressing the question of how dreams should be evaluated and how genuine spiritual content could be distinguished from merely psychological or demonic content. The framework that the medieval tradition developed had similarities to the framework that the Islamic tradition was developing during the same period, with the parallel developments reflecting both the shared scriptural inheritance and the parallel philosophical engagement with the questions that dreams raise. The work of Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, the visionary mystic whose extensive writings included accounts of her own visionary experiences and frameworks for understanding similar experiences in others, provided one of the most articulated medieval Christian treatments of the broader category of imaginal experience that includes both dreams and waking visions. The modern Christian tradition has continued to engage dreams, even as the broader cultural shift toward materialist frameworks has reduced the centrality of dream interpretation in mainstream theological reflection. The work of Morton Kelsey, the Episcopal priest whose books on dreams within Christian spirituality, including God, Dreams, and Revelation, provided substantial contemporary engagement with the tradition's dream framework, has articulated how the Christian tradition's framework can continue to inform contemporary spiritual practice. The engagement of Christian contemplative communities with dreams continues across various traditions, with the framework providing resources for spiritual discernment that the merely psychological frameworks of contemporary culture do not equally provide. The Hindu tradition has developed perhaps the most philosophically articulated framework for understanding dreams within any tradition, with the framework being developed across thousands of years of sustained reflection within the broader Hindu philosophical traditions. The Mandukya Upanishad, one of the principal Upanishads composed around the 1st century before the Common Era or earlier, provides the foundational text for the Hindu treatment of dreams. The Upanishad articulates the doctrine of the 4 states of consciousness, with the 4 states being the waking state called Jagrat, the dreaming state called Svapna, the deep sleep state called Sushupti, and the 4th state called Turiya, that transcends and includes the other three. The framework provides one of the most rigorous philosophical treatments of consciousness within any tradition, with the four states being analysed in detail across the subsequent Hindu philosophical literature. The dreaming state, on the Mandukya framework, is treated with particular philosophical sophistication. The waking state involves the engagement of consciousness with the external world through the senses, with the consciousness operating within the constraints that embodied perception imposes. The dreaming state involves the engagement of consciousness with internal contents that have been generated from the impressions accumulated during waking life, with the consciousness operating without the immediate sensory input that ordinarily structures it. The deep sleep state involves the temporary cessation of the dreaming activity, with consciousness being present in some form even though no specific contents are generated. The fourth state, Turiya, is identified as the underlying reality that is present across all three of the other states, with Turiya being the recognition of consciousness itself, rather than the engagement with any particular contents that consciousness sustains. The framework provides resources for understanding what dreams are by situating them within the broader analysis of consciousness across its various configurations. The implications of the four-state framework for understanding dreams have been worked out in considerable detail across the subsequent Hindu philosophical literature. Shankara, the 8th century philosopher whose articulation of Advaita Vedanta has been one of the most influential developments within the Hindu tradition, devoted substantial attention to the four states in his commentary on the Mandukya and in his other works. Shankara's analysis emphasizes the recognition that the dreaming consciousness is fundamentally the same as the waking consciousness, with the apparent differences being features of how consciousness operates under different conditions, rather than evidence of essentially different forms of consciousness. The framework provides resources for the recognition that the dreamer in the dream is the same as the waker in waking life and is the same as the deep sleeper in dreamless sleep, with the recognition being the foundation for the further recognition of Turiya as the underlying reality across all three states. The Yoga Vasishta, an extensive Hindu philosophical text composed in the medieval period and extensively studied within the Advaita Vedanta tradition, develops the implications of the Mandukya framework with particular sophistication. The text contains extended discussions of dreams, with the discussions exploring the implications of the recognition that the dream world is generated by consciousness itself and that the same applies, on the deeper analysis, to the waking world. The recognition has substantial parallels with the Tibetan Buddhist recognition that all phenomena are insubstantial in the same way that dreams are insubstantial, with the parallel reflecting the broader convergence between the contemplative traditions on the question of the relationship between consciousness and the contents that consciousness generates. The framework that emerges from these treatments has been one of the most sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding consciousness developed within any human tradition, and the framework remains a foundation for contemporary engagement with these questions. The work of Carl Jung in the 20th century has provided what is perhaps the most systematic Western engagement with dreams in modern times. Jung's framework, developed across his extensive writings and clinical practice, treats dreams as expressions of the unconscious psyche that contain genuinely meaningful content, rather than as the merely random byproducts of brain activity. The framework distinguishes between the personal unconscious, which contains material specific to the individual dreamer, and the collective unconscious, which contains structures that are shared across human beings as a species, and that derive from the deeper layers of the psyche that the individual life draws upon. The structures of the collective unconscious that Jung identified as archetypes appear in dreams across cultures with substantial consistency, with the cross-cultural patterns providing the empirical foundation for the framework that Jung developed. The specific archetypes that Jung identified as recurring across dream content include the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man and woman, the great mother, and the self. These archetypal structures appear, on Jung's documentation, in the dreams of people across widely different cultures and historical periods, with the patterns being too consistent to be accounted for by mere coincidence and too widespread to be the result of cultural transmission alone. The framework has been controversial within mainstream psychology, but the framework has been the foundation of substantial subsequent clinical practice and theoretical development, with depth psychological traditions including Jungian analysis, archetypal psychology developed by James Hillman, and various integrative frameworks, all drawing on Jung's foundational work. The correspondence between Jung and the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, conducted across decades and published in various volumes, including their correspondence on synchronicity and the structure of psychophysical reality, articulated some of the most striking convergences between psychological and physical thinking in the 20th century. The convergences included the recognition that the deepest structures of reality may not be the merely physical structures that materialist frameworks have assumed, with the structures involving features that connect the psychological and the physical in ways that exceed what either framework alone can capture. The work has been controversial within mainstream science, but the work has continued to be influential among researchers working at the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and physics, with the engagement continuing into the present. Pauli, whose Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded in 1945 for his discovery of the exclusion principle that bears his name, brought to the dialogue with Jung the rigorous theoretical framework of quantum mechanics and the broader philosophical questions that the foundations of quantum theory raise. Jung brought to the dialogue his decades of clinical experience with dreams and his extensive theoretical framework for understanding the structures of the psyche. The dialogue produced extensive correspondence and several published works, including the joint volume The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, published in 1955, which contained Jung's essay on synchronicity and Pauli's essay on the influence of archetypal ideas on Kepler's scientific theories. The convergence that the dialogue articulated has been one of the most significant attempts to bridge the gap between psychological and physical accounts of reality, with the implications for understanding consciousness in general and dreams in particular continuing to be worked out. The framework of synchronicity that Jung developed in part through his dialogue with Pauli has direct relevance to the questions about dreams that the inquiry has been pursuing. Synchronicity is, on Jung's framework, and a causal connecting principle that links events that have meaningful relationships without being connected through ordinary causal mechanisms. Significant dreams that anticipate subsequent events, dreams that provide information that the dreamer could not have acquired through ordinary channels, dreams that involve apparent communication between persons who are sleeping in different locations, can all be understood within the synchronicity framework as expressions of the deeper structures that connect psychological and physical reality. The framework does not require any specific physical mechanism for the connections, with the connections being expressions of the deeper structures rather than the products of any specific causal pathway. The framework remains controversial, but it provides resources for thinking about the phenomena that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately address. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context and theological commitment, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about dreaming. The traditions consistently treat dreams as significant rather than as merely random, with the significance being articulated in different ways across the different traditions, but with the structural recognition being consistent. The traditions consistently distinguish between ordinary dreams arising from the dreamer's psychological contents and significant dreams that involve content exceeding what the dreamer's waking knowledge can account for. The traditions consistently develop practices for engaging with dreams as opportunities for spiritual development, rather than as merely automatic experiences that occur during sleep. And the traditions consistently locate dreaming within a broader account of consciousness that includes other altered states, with the broader account providing the framework within which specific phenomena are understood. The convergence is not equivalence. The Tibetan dream yoga is not the Islamic ruya. Saliha is not the Christian dream. Theology is not the Hindu. Svapna is not the Jungian collective, unconscious. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that dreams are significant phenomena that bear on the deepest questions about consciousness and reality, that the cultivation of relationship to dreams is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage seriously with what the traditions have been articulating across thousands of years. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research that has been documenting the biology and physics of dreaming, suggest for how a person can inhabit the embodied existence in which dreaming is one of the principal modes of conscious experience. The hours that you spend dreaming each night are not the merely incidental byproducts of biological maintenance that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss them as. The experiences that occur during these hours have specific neurological substrates that current research has documented in considerable detail, specific phenomenological features that distinguish them from any other form of subjective experience that humans report, and specific structural parallels with frameworks from physics and philosophy that bear on the deepest questions about consciousness and reality. The contemplative traditions that have addressed dreams across thousands of years have arrived at recognitions that contemporary research is now in a position to engage with seriously, with the convergence between traditional and contemporary frameworks being one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what consciousness actually is. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit the dreaming portions of an embodied existence that constitute roughly 1/3 of the total time spent alive. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist position that has been the dominant framework in mainstream sleep research for the past several decades. The position holds that dreams are, at their deepest level, neural processes that accomplish specific cognitive functions including memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and threat simulation, with the subjective experience of dreaming being the mere byproduct of these neural processes rather than indicating any deeper significance. The original activation synthesis hypothesis articulated by Hobson and Macaulay, while substantially revised in subsequent research, remains influential as a framework that treats dreams as essentially constructed from internal neural activity without requiring any access to features of reality beyond what the brain itself contains. The position has serious defenders within contemporary neuroscience, and the cognitive functions that dreams accomplish do appear to be substantial enough to account for much of what dreams involve. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist account does explain a substantial portion of dream phenomenology, with the cognitive functions being well documented and the neural mechanisms being increasingly characterized. The recent revisions of the original framework, including the work of Solms on the forebrain basis of dreaming, and the work of various researchers on the integration of dreams with broader cognitive functions, have produced a more sophisticated materialist account than the simple version that the older models proposed. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical extensions that we have considered. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, while taken seriously by a substantial portion of the physics community, has not been established as the correct interpretation. The application of the framework to questions about dreams involves theoretical extensions that the physics community has not endorsed in any consensus form. The Bohm implicate order framework, while grounded in serious physics, has not been developed in detail by Bohm himself for questions about dreams, with the application being primarily the work of subsequent thinkers whose interpretations have varied substantially. The Penrose hammer-off framework, while supported by recent empirical work including the studies on microtubule stabilizing anesthetics, remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community, with the specific claims about dreaming being further extensions of an already speculative framework. The honest acknowledgement is that the philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about dreams beyond the materialist framework, but the frameworks do not by themselves establish that dreams are what these frameworks suggest they might be. The third objection focuses on the popular abuse of the inquiry's themes in contemporary spiritual literature. The recognition that dreams may have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive has been seized upon by various popularizers to develop frameworks that exceed what either the science or the traditions actually support. The claims that include specific identifications of soulmates whom the dreamer is supposedly meeting in dream encounters, the claims that include elaborate mythologies about parallel selves leading complete lives in alternate dimensions, the claims that include manifestation techniques for using dreams to attract specific outcomes in waking life, are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach that dreams have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive, but they taught this within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist reduction, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The work of Bohm on apparent precognition, while rigorously conducted within the constraints of laboratory research, has had a difficult replication record that the inquiry has to acknowledge. Some subsequent studies have documented effects similar to those Bohm reported, but other studies have failed to replicate the original findings, with the meta-analyses producing mixed results. The honest position is to acknowledge the controversial status of the precognition research, while also acknowledging that the questions it raises about the temporal structure of consciousness have not been definitively resolved. The popular literature on dreams has often presented precognition as if it were an established phenomenon, with the presentation going beyond what the actual research supports. The careful inquiry has to maintain the distinction between what the research has documented and what the popular literature has claimed, while also resisting the dismissive position that no questions remain open. The fourth objection concerns the difference between healthy and unhealthy forms of engagement with dreams. The traditions have all recognized that not every relationship to dreams is a manifestation of the deeper engagement that the traditions cultivate. Some relationships to dreams involve excessive identification, with the dreamer treating dream content as if it had the same status as waking reality and making waking decisions based on dream content without appropriate discernment. Some relationships to dreams involve excessive avoidance, with the dreamer ignoring or suppressing dream content that the deeper engagement would treat as significant. Some relationships to dreams involve obsessive interpretation, with the dreamer spending so much time analyzing dreams that the engagement becomes itself an obstacle to the broader spiritual development that the traditions aim to cultivate. The contemplative traditions have all developed resources for distinguishing the genuine engagement with dreams that they cultivate from the various distorted forms that can mimic the engagement, while actually undermining the conditions for spiritual development. The popular literature on dreams often elides these distinctions, treating any attention to dreams as if it were the genuine engagement that the traditions teach. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires preserving these distinctions, with the recognition that the contemplative traditions have always taught that the relationship to dreams is something that requires cultivation and discernment rather than mere attention. The fifth objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Tibetan dream yoga with its specific connection to the broader Bardo practices and its specific commitments about the nature of consciousness, is not the same as the Islamic Ruya Saliha, with its specific connection to prophetic communication and its specific commitments about the relationship between dreamer and divine reality. The Christian dream theology, with its specific connection to the biblical narratives of dream-based revelation, is not the same as the Hindu Svapna analysis, with its specific connection to the broader four-state framework of consciousness. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels, and the engagement requires resisting the temptation to construct a synthetic framework that combines elements from multiple traditions in ways that none of the traditions themselves would endorse. The sixth objection concerns the temptation to use dream practice as an escape from waking responsibility. The cultivation of practices like lucid dreaming, dream yoga, and various forms of dream interpretation can become a way of investing energy in the dream life, at the expense of engagement with the waking life that the dream practice is supposed to support. The contemplative traditions have all warned against this temptation in their own different ways. The Tibetan tradition has emphasized that dream yoga is preparation for the Bardo practices and ultimately for the cultivation of awareness across all states, not a substitute for the broader practice that the tradition cultivates. The Islamic tradition has emphasized that the engagement with dreams operates within the broader framework of religious life that includes prayer, ethical conduct, and community engagement, with the dream engagement being one element of this broader framework rather than a substitute for it. The Christian tradition has emphasized that dreams are one of the channels through which divine guidance can come, but that the genuine reception of guidance requires the broader life of faith that integrates the guidance into actual conduct. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires holding the recognition of dreams' significance together with the engagement with waking responsibility, rather than allowing the former to function as an escape from the latter. The seventh objection concerns the danger of identifying with specific dream contents in ways that the traditions have all warned against. The dreams that involve apparent encounters with specific identified spiritual figures, the dreams that involve specific guidance about specific decisions, the dreams that involve specific predictions about specific future events, are all areas where the traditions have developed substantial discernment frameworks because the simple identification of dream content with veridical reality has been recognized as a source of substantial error. The Tibetan tradition has emphasized that even significant dreams can include misleading content, with the cultivation of discernment being one of the central concerns of the practice. The Islamic tradition has distinguished the categories of dreams precisely so that the practitioner can recognize the difference between content that warrants engagement and content that should be set aside. The Christian tradition has developed extensive frameworks for the discernment of spirits that include the evaluation of dream content, with the recognition that not all apparent spiritual content is actually from the divine source that the dreamer might assume. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires taking these traditional discernment frameworks seriously rather than treating dreams as if their content automatically had the status that the dreamer's enthusiasm might attribute to it. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The neurological account of dreams documents real phenomena that exceed what the simplest materialist framework allows. The philosophical extensions provide frameworks within which these phenomena can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of what dreams actually involve and what they actually accomplish. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science, philosophy, and tradition remain distinct. And the implications for how a person can understand the dreams that constitute 1/3 of their embodied existence follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness disappears every night during the deep stages of sleep, only to reconstitute in the morning through mechanisms that current research is still working to fully characterize, has direct implications for understanding what dreaming actually involves. The dreaming consciousness is, on the broader picture, neither the same as waking consciousness nor entirely separate from it, with the relationship between the two states being one of the central questions that current research is working to address. The integration of these recognitions with the broader inquiry into what consciousness actually is provides a context within which the specific questions about dreams can be situated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has direct implications for understanding the relationship between dreams and other altered states. The work on near-death experiences and the work on end-of-life dreams have documented phenomena with substantial structural parallels to ordinary dreams, with the parallels suggesting that common features of consciousness may be operating across the various altered states. The dreams that occur during the dying process, on the documentation of researchers including Christopher Kerr at Buffalo Hospice, have specific features, including frequent encounters with deceased loved ones and the sense of being prepared for what is coming. The features point toward the recognition that dreams may not be the merely subjective experiences that the materialist framework treats them as, with the specific phenomena suggesting something more substantial about what consciousness actually involves. The recognition that the deepest physical structure of reality involves connections between distant systems that cannot be explained by any local mechanism, that quantum non-locality is a real feature of how reality is organized at the deepest level that current science has accessed, provides a framework within which the connections between dreaming and the broader structure of reality can be understood. The connections are not the literal quantum entanglement that some popular literature has claimed. The connections are the application to the case of dreams of the broader recognition that classical separation is not the deepest description of how reality is structured. The framework allows the documented phenomena of dreams to be understood within a physics that has moved beyond classical assumptions, without requiring the specific claims about literal access to parallel branches that the actual physics does not support. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address, the synchronicity that Jung and Pauli articulated and that subsequent research has continued to investigate, has direct relevance for understanding the dreams that involve apparent connections with persons or events at a distance. The synchronicity framework does not require any specific physical mechanism for the connections, with the connections being expressions of the deeper structures rather than the products of any specific causal pathway. The framework allows the documented phenomena of dreams that involve apparent communication or anticipation to be understood without requiring the specific claims about literal entanglement or precognition that the more popular literature has often made. The careful application of the framework to dreams maintains the distinction between what the framework establishes and what additional speculation would add, with the maintenance of this distinction being one of the disciplines that the inquiry has been cultivating throughout. The recognition that information may be the fundamental substrate of physical reality, that the deepest structure of the universe may be informational rather than material, places dreaming within a context that exceeds the merely biological. The information that constitutes a dream, the specific patterns of neural activity that generate the dream experience, may have features that participate in the broader informational structure of reality, rather than being merely the local neural patterns that the materialist framework would suggest. The implications for what dreams accomplish are significant. If dreams are informational patterns that participate in the broader structure of reality, then the dreams may have access to information beyond what the local neural patterns would themselves contain, with the access being a feature of the informational structure rather than requiring any specific mechanism of access. The recognition that consciousness may itself be a fundamental feature of reality, rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations. The panpsychist position that has been articulated by Strawson and Chalmers and other contemporary philosophers has direct implications for understanding what the dreaming consciousness actually is. If consciousness is fundamental, then the dreaming consciousness is not the deficient version of waking consciousness that the materialist framework treats it as. The dreaming consciousness is a particular configuration of the fundamental consciousness that constitutes reality at the deepest level, with the specific features of this configuration being different from those of waking consciousness, but not deficient in any sense that would prevent the configuration from accessing features of reality that the waking configuration does not access. The framework provides resources for thinking about why dreams have the specific phenomenological features they have, with the affective intensity, the embodied immediacy, and the apparent access to information beyond ordinary waking knowledge being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests, that the past, present, and future may all exist with equal reality on the block universe interpretation of relativity, has direct implications for understanding the dreams that involve apparent access to events that have not yet occurred in the dreamer's experience timeline. The framework does not establish that such access actually occurs in any specific case, but the framework removes the metaphysical objection that the future does not exist and therefore cannot be accessed, with the question becoming an empirical question about what mechanisms might be involved. The implications for the dream phenomenology that traditional accounts have documented across thousands of years are significant, with the apparent precognitive content of certain dreams being a phenomenon whose possibility the block universe framework establishes, even as its actuality in specific cases remains controversial. The recognition that the bond between persons that we have examined in connection with love includes features that exceed the merely psychological, has direct implications for understanding the dreams that involve apparent connections with specific persons. The neurological research on love has documented that bonded partners maintain neural representations of each other that operate even during their physical separation. The implications for the dreams that involve specific encounters with bonded partners, including dreams that include deceased loved ones with vividness and specificity that ordinary memory would not produce, follow naturally from the broader picture. The dreams may be expressions of the continuing operation of the neural representations rather than the literal encounters that some popular literature has claimed, but the dreams may also involve features of the broader connection between bonded persons that the merely psychological framework cannot adequately address. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian recognition that dreams can be channels of divine communication, articulated across the biblical narratives and developed in the subsequent theological tradition, identifies a feature of dreams that the materialist framework cannot adequately address. The Islamic recognition that the truthful dream is a continuing form of prophetic communication, articulated in the Hadith literature and developed in the subsequent tradition, identifies a parallel feature in a different theological vocabulary. The Tibetan recognition that dreams provide an opportunity for the cultivation of awareness that the constraints of waking life do not equally provide, articulated in the dream yoga tradition, identifies a practical implication of the recognition that dreams have a significance the materialist framework does not capture. The convergence between these traditional recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about the phenomenology and neurology of dreams suggests that the traditions were attending to features of reality that have a real basis, with the technical resources for articulating this basis being beyond what the original traditions could provide, but consistent with what they were pointing toward. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical extensions, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to dreams than the relationship that the standard materialist framework allows. The traditions have all developed practices that cultivate this different relationship, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as the means by which the recognition is transmitted from one generation of practitioners to the next, There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of cultivation, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the practice of recording dreams upon waking, before the immediate engagement with waking concerns dissipates the memory of the dream content. The practice does not require any specific theological commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to maintain a journal in which dreams are recorded with as much specificity as memory allows, with the recording being itself one of the means by which the relationship to dreams deepens over time. The accumulated record provides the foundation for recognizing patterns across dreams that single dreams in isolation would not reveal, with the patterns being one of the features that the engagement with dreams cultivates over extended periods. A second practice draws on the lucid dreaming research and the Tibetan dream yoga tradition. The practice involves the cultivation of the capacity to recognize that one is dreaming while the dream continues, with the recognition providing the foundation for further practices that the tradition has developed. The specific techniques include reality testing during waking life, in which the practitioner regularly checks whether the current experience is a dream, by examining its features for the kinds of inconsistencies that distinguish dreams from waking experience. The techniques include specific intentions formed before sleep, in which the practitioner deliberately commits to recognizing the dream as a dream when it occurs. The techniques include the wake back to bed method, in which the practitioner wakes briefly during the night before returning to sleep with the specific intention of cultivating lucidity. The practices have documented effects on the frequency and stability of lucid dreams, with the cultivation being available to anyone willing to apply the disciplines that the practices require. The Tibetan tradition has developed specific further practices for those who establish the capacity for lucid dreaming. The practitioner who has stabilized lucidity is instructed to engage in specific transformations of the dream content as means of cultivating the recognition that all phenomena are insubstantial in the same way that dreams are insubstantial. The transformations include changing dream objects into other objects, multiplying single objects into many, traversing dream environments without spatial constraints, and dissolving the apparent boundary between the dreamer and the dream. The practices are not merely curiosities of dream phenomenology. The practices are training in the recognition of the structure of consciousness itself, with the training extending beyond the dream state into the broader conduct of the practitioner's waking life. The integration of these practices with the broader dream yoga tradition has been articulated in detail by contemporary teachers including Tenzin, Wangyal Rinpoche and others, with the practices remaining accessible to anyone willing to engage them with appropriate discipline. A third practice draws on the Islamic tradition of istikhara, the prayer for divine guidance performed before significant decisions. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment in the strong sense. The practice involves the deliberate framing of a question or decision before sleep, with the practitioner attending to the dreams that arise in the period following the framing. The practice has been used across the Islamic world for more than 1,000 years, and similar practices have been developed in various other traditions, with the underlying recognition being that the dreaming consciousness can engage with questions that the waking consciousness has not been able to resolve through ordinary deliberation. The practice provides a structured way of using the dream channel for purposes that the merely materialist framework would not recognize, with the use being one of the documented disciplines that the contemplative traditions have transmitted across centuries. A fourth practice draws on the Christian tradition of discernment of spirits, which has provided sophisticated frameworks for evaluating the various contents that arise within consciousness, including dream contents. The practice involves the regular examination of dream content for the patterns that the tradition has identified as characteristic of different sources, with the examination being conducted in the broader context of spiritual development that the tradition cultivates. The practice does not require any specific theological commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to engage with dream content critically rather than uncritically, with the critical engagement being one of the disciplines that distinguishes the genuine cultivation of relationship to dreams from the various distorted forms that can mimic the cultivation while actually undermining it. A fifth practice involves the integration of dream content into the waking life, rather than treating dreams as if they were a separate domain that does not interact with waking concerns. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that the relationship between dreams and waking life is bidirectional, with the cultivation of the relationship requiring active engagement on both sides of the boundary. The practice involves the regular consideration of how specific dreams may bear on specific waking concerns, with the consideration being one of the means by which the dream engagement contributes to the broader life of the practitioner. The practice does not require treating dreams as if they were oracles that provide direct answers to waking questions. The practice requires only the willingness to consider dreams as one of the inputs to the broader process of reflection that the conscious life involves, with the consideration being available to anyone willing to apply the disciplines that the engagement requires. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the dreamer and the dreams. The relationship becomes less an unconscious automatism and more a conscious engagement that contributes to the broader life. The attention to dreams becomes less an occasional curiosity and more a sustained discipline that informs how the practitioner lives. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with one of the principal modes of conscious experience that the embodied existence makes available, with the deepening being possible across the entire span of the life in which the dreaming continues. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition that the dreams that occur during the hours of sleep that punctuate your existence are not the merely incidental phenomena that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to take them as. A recognition that the experiences that occur during these hours have features that exceed what the materialist framework can adequately address, with the features pointing toward dimensions of consciousness and reality that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions have all been working to articulate. A recognition that the cultivation of relationship to dreams is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, that the cultivation can be practiced through the methods that the traditions have developed across thousands of years, and that the cultivation has effects on the embodied life that you currently have. The question of whether the philosophical and contemplative frameworks that have been examined are correct in their strongest forms is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit the dreaming portions of your existence in light of the recognitions that the inquiry has pointed toward is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The body that reads these words will, tonight, undergo the cycle of sleep that produces the experiences that the inquiry has been examining. The brain will move through the various stages of non-REM and REM sleep that contemporary research has documented in detail. The dreams that will occur during these stages will involve the integration of memories from the day, the consolidation of learned material, the emotional regulation of difficult experiences, and possibly other functions that the various frameworks have suggested, but that current research has not yet fully characterized. The experiences that you will have during these dreams will be subjectively vivid, emotionally intense, and structurally complex in ways that exceed what the merely random activity of earlier models could account for. None of this is hypothetical. All of this is the documented condition of your actual existence as a conscious being, whose existence includes these hours of dreaming as one of its central features. The question is not whether you dream. The question is what kind of relationship you will cultivate with the dreams that are already constituting roughly 1/3 of the consciousness you have during your embodied life. You spend 1/3 of your life in this state, not 8 hours of nothing, not 8 hours of biological maintenance with subjective accompaniment that can be safely ignored. 1/3 of your life in a state whose features the inquiry has been examining and whose significance the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their understanding of consciousness. The fact that you have been trained to dismiss this 1/3 of your existence is itself a feature of the dominant cultural framework that the inquiry has been calling into question. with the dismissal being one of the more striking examples of how the materialist framework has shaped what is taken to be self-evident about the nature of conscious experience. The recognition that this third of your existence may have a significance that the dismissal has obscured is the recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward, with the implications for how you can inhabit this third of your existence being among the most consequential implications of any of the questions that the inquiry has examined. When you next wake from a dream that has the features the inquiry has been examining, when you find yourself returning from a place that you have never been, to people you have never met, to a body that does not feel quite like the body you were inhabiting just moments before, consider for a moment what is actually happening. The experience that you are returning from is not the merely random byproduct of brain activity that the cultural framework has trained you to dismiss it as. The experience is one of the principal forms in which your consciousness operates across the span of your embodied existence. The choice of how to engage this experience, with what quality of attention and what depth of recognition, is the choice that constitutes one of the central forms of your conscious life. You have time. The time is finite. The dreams that are constituting roughly 1/3 of your remaining existence are not infinitely available to you, with the embodied form of their availability being constrained by the same biological mortality that constrains your waking existence. What you do with the dreams, what kind of relationship you cultivate with this central feature of your existence, is among the most consequential choices that any conscious being can make. The recognition that the inquiry has examined will not be available to you in the moments when it is most needed as a theoretical framework for analysis. The recognition will be available, if it is available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with your dreams across the years that preceded the moments. The cultivation matters. The practices matter. The recognition that dreams are something more than what the materialist framework allows is not a recognition that produces its effects through mere intellectual assent. The recognition produces its effects through the gradual transformation of how the dreamer engages the dreams, with the transformation being possible across the entire span of the embodied existence in which the dreaming unfolds. You will sleep tonight. You will dream tonight. The choice of what to do with this fact is yours alone to make. The night is approaching as you read these words. The cycle of sleep that produces the experiences the inquiry has been examining will begin within hours of when you have finished engaging with this material. The brain will move through its stages, the dreams will arise, and for several hours of the night, the consciousness that constitutes you will operate in a configuration whose features the inquiry has been articulating and whose significance the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their understanding of conscious existence. You will not remember most of what you experience. You will dismiss what you do remember as merely the random products of sleep. Or you will not. The choice is the one that this entire inquiry has been pointing toward. The dreams are coming. What you make of them is the question whose answer will constitute one of the most consequential dimensions of the embodied life that you currently have.